Calling Black Americans African is historically inaccurate. The United States never legally classified us as Africans. Not in the Constitution, not in the slave codes, not in the 14th Amendment, not in Jim Crow laws, not in any federal or state statute. From the 1600s to the 1960s, the population we descend from was never a purely African group, and the identity African American didn't even exist until the late 1980s. So today we're going to break down exactly why Africans are not in the U.S. Constitution and what that means for the true identity of Black Americans. Let's get into it. Let's start with the numbers because the numbers alone destroy the idea that Black Americans are Africans. Only 300,000 to 400,000 Africans were brought to what became the United States over 250 years. That's it. But by 1860, there were 4 million enslaved people in this country. And today, there are over 40 million Black Americans. That population could not have come from Africans alone. The math doesn't work. So how did the population grow? Because the enslaved population absorbed Native Americans, Europeans, mixed communities, free people of color, and generations of American-born children. The legal category Negro was a caste, not a continent. It included anyone the system placed inside it regardless of ancestry. So when people say descendants of enslaved Africans, they're skipping the truth. The enslaved population was never purely African. It was a mixed American-born population from the very beginning. Now let's look at the law because the law tells the truth even when society lies. From the 1600s to the 1960s, U.S. law used the terms Negro, mulatto, colored, person of color, slave, freedman, but never African, African descent, African American, not in the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, slave codes, black codes, Jim Crow laws, or the Civil Rights Acts. If the population had been legally African, the law would have said African. It didn't because it wasn't true. The lawmakers knew the population was American-born, racially mixed, not tied to any African nation, not a foreign group, not an immigrant population. This is why Africans are not in the Constitution, because the people the Constitution was written about were not Africans. The 14th Amendment is one of the clearest pieces of evidence. It was written in 1866 for one specific group. The people enslaved under U.S. law, the freedmen, the Negro population. It was not written for Africans living in Africa, African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, foreigners, or any other group. It even excluded Native Americans living in sovereign nations, calling them Indians not taxed. Why? Because the 14th Amendment was lineage-based, not continent-based. It was written to overturn the Dred Scott decision, which said Black Americans had no rights. The amendment restored citizenship to the people who had been enslaved here, not to Africans. Again, this is why Africans are not in the Constitution. Now let's talk about something most people never learn. Native Americans were heavily enslaved in what became the United States. The Spanish enslaved Native people in the Southeast. The English enslaved Native people in Virginia and the Carolinas. The Carolinas ran a massive Native slave trade. Some historians say larger than the African trade in that region. And here's where it gets even more important. Early European explorers described many Southeastern Native groups as black, tawny, Negro-like, as dark as Ethiopians with curled or woolly hair. So when the Africans who escaped the failed Spanish colony in 1526 ran into native tribes, they blended in. They weren't hunted down. They weren't treated as outsiders. They weren't visually distinct. Why? Because the phenotype overlap was real. Those native groups already had dark-skinned, curly-haired people. This is why later U.S. laws could reclassify many dark indigenous groups as Negro. Not because they were African, but because Negro was a caste based on appearance and social position. This is why the Southeast today is heavily Black, and why so many Black families have deep local non-African roots. People often ask, how did the enslaved population grow from a few 100,000 Africans to 4 million people? Here's the answer. Because the U.S. had a self-reproducing slave system. Enslaved women were forced to have children. Children inherited slave status. Families were kept together long enough to reproduce, and the enslaved population absorbed Native people, mixed people, European ancestry, and American-born generations. By the 1700s and 1800s, most enslaved people were already American-born, racially mixed, and several generations removed from Africa. This is why the law never used the word African, because the population wasn't African. Now let's jump forward. The term African American did not exist as a universal identity until the late 1980s. It was pushed around 1988 to 1990 by certain civil rights leaders, certain academics, media institutions, and government agencies. It was a political rebranding, not a historical identity. And the structure of the term implies foreign origin, immigrant status, a homeland outside the U.S., but Black Americans are not an immigrant group. We are a native lineage-based U.S. population formed on American soil with 400 plus years of continuous presence. With African ancestry, yes, but also Native and European ancestry and a distinct culture, history, and identity. Calling Black Americans African American rewrites our identity as foreign when it is actually Native. Let's break down the classifications clearly. Slave was illegal status, not an ethnicity. A slave could be African, Native American mixed, American-born, or even European descended. If the mother was enslaved, Negro was a racial caste, not a continent. It included dark indigenous people, mixed people, African-descended people, and anyone the system placed inside that category. So, slave never meant African. African never meant slave. This is why Africans are not in the Constitution, because the Constitution wasn't written about Africans, it was written about the Negro caste, a mixed American-born population. So who are Black Americans? We are a distinct people, a people formed in the United States, a people with African ancestry, yes, but not African identity. A people with Native and European ancestry woven into our lineage. A people shaped by a unique history, culture, and experience that exists nowhere else on Earth. We are not an African immigrant group. We are not foreigners. We are not outsiders. We are Native, foundational American people. And that is why Africans are not in the U.S. Constitution. Because the people the Constitution was written about, the people enslaved in this country, were not Africans. They were Negroes, a mixed American-born caste that became the Black American people we know today. The numbers prove it. The laws prove it. The history proves it. The Constitution proves it. Black Americans are not Africans. We are a people formed right here in the United States, and it's time to tell the truth about who we really are. Thank you for watching. We'll catch up on the next video.